please.
Good afternoon, everyone. As a courtesy to our guest speaker and the Zoom participants, I must ask everyone who's not already muted to please mute their audio to minimize the background noise. Even if you aren't speaking, your mic will pick up the ambient sound, such as a phone ringing, and make it difficult for everyone else on the Zoom to clearly hear the speaker. You can unmute when we arrive at the Q&A portion of the program if you want to ask a question, or you can ask it in the chat. A special thank you goes out to Hillcrest members Helene and Howard Jacob in appreciation for recommending today's intriguing and entertaining program. Much gratitude to Executive Director Rose Sigler and the Hillcrest office staff, including Special Events Coordinator Melissa Gerstein, Juana Santos, and Brana Hammer for assisting with today's Zoom presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us today as we welcome Roy Schwartz, acclaimed author of the recently published and provocatively titled, Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. I'll give you a little background on Roy. Roy graduated magna cum laude from the New School University with a bachelor's in English, majoring in creative writing with a minor in journalism, and cum laude from New York University with an interdisciplinary master's in English and social thought, focusing on 19th century British and 20th century American literature. He interned for Marvel Comics. Roy has written for newspapers, magazines, websites, academic organizations, law firms, tech companies, toy companies, and production studios. He has taught English and writing at the City University of New York and is a former writer-in-residence fellow at the New York Public Library. When not writing, he is the director of marketing and business development of a regional law firm. Originally from Tel Aviv, Roy grew up a voracious reader of everything from Israeli novels to British plays to American comic books. He taught himself English from comics and cartoons, which is why he's comfortable using words like swell. Roy lives in Long Island, New York with his wife, Kim, a best-selling author and editor, and their 2 children. He has a penchant for caffeine, candy, and a quality over quantity wardrobe. Please welcome Roy Schwartz.
Thank you. Thank you. You guys got the long version of the bio, so now you know everything there is to know about me. So thank you for having me, and thank you for joining me on this day. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. This always takes a minute, so please bear with me. We will share. Okay. What I'm going to ask you guys is to hold a thumbs up if what you're seeing is the full screen slide. Wonderful. So that is the cover of my book, Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. And before we get into the thick of it, one thing that I want to get out of the way is the title. I keep getting asked about this all the time. People constantly say, well, is he circumcised? How was he circumcised? All these kind of questions that keeps popping up. So eventually I have come up with an answer. Did this slide move for you, by the way? I'm seeing there's a delay that I'm seeing on my end, but it could be the loop.
I think it's okay. I don't think there's a problem.
Oh, apologies. Oh, there we go. Now we got it. Now you see the second slide, right? That explains it. Okay. So if you are familiar with the mythology on planet Krypton, Superman's dad was named Jor-El. His birth name on planet Krypton was Kal-El, and he was circumcised by Moel. It's a dad joke, but I'm very proud of it, and I have no apologies. So, but seriously, so is this guy Jewish? And the answer is yes. Superman, the first and greatest superhero, arguably the most famous hero in fiction, is a Jewish character. His mythology is rich in Jewish themes and symbolism and metaphor. And I always compare it to those, you remember in the 90s, they had those magic eye pictures that you had to sort of see through static. I compare it to that. Once you see that image behind it, you can't not see it. And Superman is based first and foremost on Judaism's greatest hero, which is Moses. Some of you are a bit more into pop culture, may know about these parallels, so bear with me as I start at the beginning, bring everybody up to speed, and then we'll break some new ground. Superman, as I said, on planet Krypton is born Kal-El. And El is, of course, a very evocative in Hebrew. It's the Hebrew word for God, right? It's also a theophoric suffix, meaning a suffix bearing the name of God in the name of all the angels and prophets of the Bible, like Gabriel, like Daniel, like Michael, Michael, like Israel, and like Kal-El. Moses also is a theophoric name in that it combines the root, in Hebrew Moses is Moshe, right? It combines the root mash, which means to extricate or to take out of or deliver from, and Hey, which is another, it's Adonai, it's one of the names of God. So the name Moses in Hebrew means somebody who is delivered from and somebody who delivers, somebody who is saved and a savior, somebody chosen by God and somebody chosen for God. The parallels in their origin are the most obvious ones, and these have been pointed to before me. To save baby Kal-El's life from the impending doom of his people, he's placed in a small vessel. He's sent adrift to an unknown fate. He lands on Earth amidst thick vegetation. He's found and raised by people not his own. His adoptive mother renames him, and upon adulthood, he goes into the world as a great savior. Again, once you see these parallels, you can now never not see them. But that's not where these parallels end. Their teenage years, which is something that has not been discussed before, really overlap and correspond too. If you remember the movie Superman from 1978, the one with Christopher Reeve, and if you've never seen it or haven't seen it in a while, highly recommended. It's really, the effects are a bit shoddy 40 years in, but as a story, it really holds. When he turns 18, he goes on this walkabout across the North Pole, whereupon he encounters the Fortress of Solitude, this beautiful structure that I'm sitting in, where he encounters the hologram of his father, or recording of his father, and this kind of bright apparition tells him where he comes from, his true origins, and sends him back into the world as a savior. Well, that is the story of Moses crossing the desert of Midian, another type of wasteland, and instead of encountering a hologram out of ice, he encounters a burning bush. But thematically, these two are parallel. And this story element has proven so popular that it's been folded since from the movies into the Congo Book canon, which is what you can see on the bottom left. And even the speech patterns are very, very similar. In the Superman movie, he says, I am Jor-El, I am your father. They can be a great people, Kal-El they wish to be. They only lack the light to show the way. For this reason above all, the capacity for good, I have sent them you, my only son. If you look at the parallel section in Exodus, where Moses comes across the burning bush, God speaks to him and said, I am God of your father. I have surely seen the affliction of my people. I have come down to deliver them. Come now and I will send you, that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel. It's almost one-to-one. And by the way, according to one Talmud story, the burning bush started talking to Moses in the actual voice of his birth father, Amram, as to not frighten him. Moses is a primary, but not the only influence on Superman. Superman was created by two Jewish guys. We're going to get to them in a second. And one of them, the writer Jerry Siegel, wrote a memoir in 1979 that was promptly lost, never published, and was not found until 2011. And in it, he details in great detail all the influences that led to the creation of Superman. And one of them is the biblical the biblical Samson, sorry. Samson, of course, is famous for his super strength. Before you could reference something and say, what am I, Superman? What am I, the Incredible Hulk? You would say things like, what am I, Hercules? What am I, Samson? He famously topples the Philistine temple, right? He uses the jawbone of a donkey to smite 1,000 Philistines. He tears a lion in half, et cetera, et cetera. But Samson also had super speed. There's a story in the Bible where he chases and outruns 300 foxes. And in the Gemara, there's also a story that he leaps in a single bound from Tzorah to Eshtaol, two ancient towns at a distance of about 4 miles. And for all of his might, Samson was a judge. He was an Israelite judge, right? He's the book of Judges. He fought in the name of truth and justice. And again, Superman's creator recognizes him as a direct influence. In the old comics, in the original comics, Superman is constantly referenced to as a modern Moses, or somebody possessing the power of a modern Samson, or possessing the power, the might of a dozen Samsons, et cetera, et cetera. And this cover you see of Superman #4 is a conscious and deliberate homage to that story. Despite these parallels, and I really just touched on, a little bit of them, there's many more in the book, Superman in the wider public is sort of seen as a Christ figure. And it sort of makes sense, right? He's a great savior from the heavens. He's sent by a father named God. His name is God, et cetera, et cetera. But these parallels, why I don't think they're any less legitimate, really showed up decades after Superman's creation, and not in the prime text in the comics, but in movies and TV shows. This, for example, is from 2016's Batman v Superman. You see this hovering and halos behind him and all these kind of nimbus, salvific imagery. This is Smallville from 2001. He's literally crucified, except instead of nailed, he's tied down to a couple of planks of wood. From 2006, Superman Returns. His mother cradles him injured like Michelangelo's Pieta. Also from Superman's Return, he's stabbed, Lex Luthor stabs him with a shard of kryptonite in the side, sort of like the Spear of Destiny, right, the Spear of Longinus. And then we have the Zack Snyder movies starring Henry Cavill. This one is Man of Steel from 2013 that are just rife. They're overflowing with Christian imagery. In this case, Clark is consulting with his pastor in a church, and you have a Jesus figure in red robes right behind him in a stained glass window. My favorite is this over-the-top, hitting you over the head crucifix pose. The top is from Smallville, the middle is from Superman Returns, and the bottom is from Man of Steel. You see this again and again and again. The more Christian it becomes, the less subtle it becomes, which I think is entertaining. But, as I said, Superman is a Jewish creation, and he was created by 2 Jews, and not just 2 Jews, 2 Jewish teenagers. The guy on the left is Jerry Siegel. He was the writer, and the guy on the right is Joe Simon, and he was the artist. Siegel came from the family Segalowitz, Lithuanian Jews that moved to Cleveland, Ohio, to Glenville. That was a very large Jewish community at the time, where he was born. And Shusterovich was a family that came from Crimea through Rotterdam, and then eventually to Toronto in Canada, and then came. There's Jewish immigration patterns. The two met in high school and became best friends at first sight, and set about creating Superman, which they did in 1934 at the age of 17, which is not a bad thing for a couple of Jewish teenagers to create. And aside from the Man of Steel, they also created Superman's alter ego, which is Clark Kent. And Clark Kent, if you're familiar with all this mythology, is, he's the secret identity. He's this bespectacled, nebbishy, Schlemiel, Schlemazel character. And just like Siegel and Schuster based Superman on Moses and on Samson and some other Jewish elements, they based Clark Kent on themselves. Superman was their wish fulfillment. He was their personal avatar, but Clark Kent was their reality. And they discussed this in numerous occasions in interviews and in the unpublished memoir. Siegel even modeled as Clark Kent for Schuster to draw. He was that literally based on them. In one interview, they said that in their mind, when he opens the shirt and you see that big red S, it stands for Siegel and Schuster. And of course, Clark Kent is also a checklist of Jewish stereotypes. Certainly then, he's basically Woody Allen, right? So the two boy chicks shopped this novel idea around, and no one wanted it. Here's the thing to understand. Superman is the first superhero. There was no precedent. There was nothing like him before. We had the pulps in the radio and in pulp magazines, and the heroes there were cowboys, policemen, G-men, soldiers, treasure hunters, swashbucklers, et cetera, et cetera. And here was a spaceman who happened to look human, who dressed in long johns and Wellingtons and a cape, who flew through the air and crashed through walls and bullet spouts off his chest. There was nothing remotely like him before. The whole idea was too mashugana, right? People had no idea what to do with it. And for 4 years, this is one of my favorite elements of the creation story of Superman, from 1934 to 1938, they pitched him and got rejected from every single newspaper syndicate in the United States. The concept was just too alien itself. They got answers that it lacked appeal, that it didn't have lasting power. My personal favorite from King Features Syndicate, which was one of the biggest ones, that the idea was too fantastical for kids to relate to. It was that much of a novel concept. Second. One more thing happened in 1934, and that is the comic book got invented. And the comic book medium is a Jewish invention, and the superhero genre is a Jewish invention. To remind you, this was the Depression, 25% unemployment, and an out-of-work school teacher named Maxwell Ginsburg from the Bronx, had to move together with his family back in with his mom in the Bronx. He didn't have a job. And one day his Yiddish mama was driving him nuts, so he hid from her in the attic, pretending to clean it. What he really did was opened old boxes of newspapers and started reading for fun the old Sunday funnies, the newspaper strips they had, and had a whole page on Sundays. And a light bulb went over his head. He decided, what if I licensed these old strips from the newspaper syndicates and then reprinted them in magazine format and sold that for a dime? And by the way, that's why they're named comic book, because originally the content was all comical. It was all the funny strips. And what you see on the right is the very first comic book as we define it, which is Famous Funnies #1, which came out in July 1934. And the idea caught on, and soon enough, it became somewhat of a cottage industry. And a couple of years into it, the publishers started running out of material because there's only so many comic strips that you can license and cut and paste and create magazines of. They started commissioning new content. And one such company was Detective Comics, known today as DC. So if you know your company's DC Comics, is like saying Detective Comics. I always get a kick out of that, which was a Jewish-owned and run enterprise by two Jewish quasi-mobsters that made their fortune doing bootlegging and pornography in the early days of the Depression. And they started this publishing house. It did okay. And they came up with a new anthology called Action Comics. And they already had the printer booked. They had a deadline, but they were 13 pages short of the comic itself. And the deadline was looming. In a mad dash to meet the deadline, again, the printer was already booked, they pulled a story they had previously rejected from the rejected pile, the slush pile, and threw it in. And they didn't think about this. This was not intellectual property. This wasn't subject to scrutiny. This was just like a high volume, low cost business. They threw this wacky story called Superman in and went to print. And so in June 1938, Superman debuted on the cover of Action Comics #1. And as it turned out, the idea was not too fantastical for kids to relate to, or for adults for that matter. The best-selling comic series until then sold about 200,000 copies a month. The very top successes reached sometimes 400,000 copies. That was considered a runaway bestseller. Superman sold 2.2 million. By 1942, he was selling 12 million. His strip, the one got rejected everywhere, ended up being syndicated in 230 newspapers, reaching an audience of 25 million readers. By the way, just to give you a scale, the United States population at the time was 132 million. So, everything I'm saying, multiply that by about 2.5 to get an idea of what it would be today. 1940, just a year and a half since he showed up, still the Depression still raging on, he got his own radio series, The Adventures of Superman, which was immensely popular. It had an audience of 4.5 million people, about a third of whom were adults because families listened together. And it lasted a staggering 2,088 episodes. he starred in his own cartoon serial. There's no TV back then. These were short cartoons that were shown in movie theaters before feature films that had an audience of 20 million viewers, and in many ways prefigured film noir by about a decade and change. He was the star attraction of the 1940 New York World's Fair that had a dedicated Superman Day that broke all attendance records. He got his own balloon in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Time magazine declared him the #1 juvenile Vogue in the US, which is not bad at all considering the Depression. You would think that for two high school educated Jews during the Depression, this would be more than enough. By today's standards, they were making millions. But it wasn't enough because they created their hero with a purpose. They drew on their culture when creating Superman, particularly Moses and Samson, but the impetus for creating Superman, and again, they talk about this in various interviews, was the rise of Nazism and anti-Semitism domestically, and their frustration what was going on and the world's indifference. Superman was really their reaction formation. And so in February 1940, we're talking almost 2 years before Pearl Harbor, when the vast majority of the American public was staunchly against intervention, right? They published a 2-page story titled How Superman Would Win the War in Look magazine, which was a competitor of Life magazine. And that's the story you see here before you. You see the cheap production value. Nobody thought much about these things. And in this wonderful wish fulfillment story, Superman strolls through the Siegfried Line. That was the impregnable fortification line between Germany and France. He strolls through the line. He bends Nazi cannons into pretzels. He swats the Luftwaffe out of the sky like they were flies. He goes to Germany and to Russia and grabs Hitler and Stalin by the scruff of their necks. They were allies at the time, following Ribbentrop-Molotov, which Hitler would break like 2 months later. And he brings these two dictators to stand trial for war crimes in Geneva in the League of Nations. And, it's a cute wish fulfillment fantasy. It's especially from two Jews, but ultimately, who cares, right? It's just a 2-page story in a forgettable magazine starring a comic book, a kid's character. Who cares about this stuff, right? The Nazis cared. And what you see before you is Das Schwarze Kopf, the official newspaper of the SS, the Nazi commando. And they had the editor-in-chief of which, and the publisher of which, by the way, was Joseph Goebbels. So he was aware of the content. And in a full-page tirade, which has been attributed to Goebbels himself by some historians, they accused Superman of being, and get this because you can't invent this stuff, right? Reality, truth is stranger than fiction. They accused Superman of being pernicious Jewish propaganda to brainwash impressionable American youth with false Jewish values like protecting the innocent, defending the weak, and helping the other. Right? The Nazis had this whole warped Übermensch concept, right? Survival of the fittest and Lebensraum, the living room and all this kind of stuff. This guy was anathema to them. And the article that they wrote is so amazing that I didn't truncate it. In my book, it's translated word for word. I didn't cut it short at all. It's an amazing thing to read. The several accounts, again, attribute this article directly to Joseph Goebbels, who may or may not have even had a conniption about it in the middle of a Reichstag meeting. Clearly, Superman hit a nerve. Either way, this was reported on pretty widely in the US, how these two Jewish youths managed to ruffle the feathers of the vaunted master race. And the Bund sent them death threats and bomb threats. They picketed DC's offices. It was scary. They were 23 at the time. This was scary times, the German-American Bund, the American Nazi Party, just had a parade in 1939 down Fifth Avenue in New York, 22,000 people strong. These were scary times. Common sense, these are all family men, common sense would be to tone down, right? To lay low. Not so much. Issue after issue, cover after cover, they pilloried Hitler and his cronies, they lampooned them, they humiliated them, and they did so throughout the war. This was, some genuine grade A chutzpah, right? But it wasn't just that. This was deliberate grassroots propaganda. They knew what they were doing. If you look at these two covers for Superman 12 and Superman 18, these things on their flanks are World War I recruitment posters that are clearly the inspiration for these covers. They knew what they were doing. They had an agenda to promote. They had a message to get out. And amazingly enough, this is not something that had been picked up on so far. And when the US did join the war, that message was carried out by American servicemen, about 8 million of whom read comics regularly. Superman comics essentially became regulation equipment. Army jeeps and tanks, Navy boats, and especially Air Force planes were named after him and carried his image. If you look at the bottom, that's the US Air Force Reserve 33rd Bomber Squadron. An entire bombardment squadron adopted him as its official insignia and name, became the Superman Squadron. This was politicking through punching. Superman, it was Siegel and Schuster's avatar, literally created in their image, sent out into the war. And with American forces carrying his comics in their pocket and his image on their vehicles, Superman was right there on the front lines in real life fighting Nazis. What he was a golem. Superman wasn't just a fantasy. He was an imaginary bodyguard sent to defend the Jews from their assailants. And I say in the book that he was a mighty protector fashioned into existence and given life through language and through art, except instead of like the legend of the golem through clay and incantations, through sculpting and incanting, he was given life through drawing and writing. Instead of a man of clay, he was a man of steel. But this wasn't just metaphorical. In his unpublished memoir, Siegel describes how he was strongly influenced by the Legend of the Golem of Prague, particularly the 1920 movie. There was a German silent horror movie called The Golem, written and directed by the Jewish Henrik Galeen, which Siegel saw as a kid. It was a huge hit and it heavily inspired him to create his own indestructible, indefatigable, super strong defender of the innocent. And Superman originally was called Champion of the Oppressed, long before he was known as Man of Steel. The Legend of the Golem, particularly this 1920 movie version, was used wholesale for the origin of Bizarro. That's a guy on the bottom right that looks like he needs a tan, who in 1958, was created in 1958 and became one of Superman's most famous and lasting adversaries. Even this little girl who's not afraid of the golem, she made her way into the comic as well. So they just lifted it and just put him in tights and called it a day, which I think is great. And Bizarro is an artificial duplicate of Superman who's well-meaning, but is destructive and ultimately has to be stopped. And that's about Superman. But then there's Clark Kent, right? And Clark Kent is Superman's alter ego. He's anxious, neurotic, and awkward, yet he's cerebral. He's writerly, he's wisecracking. He's a crusader for justice as a reporter in his own right. He's basically a burlesque, a checklist of Jewish stereotypes. Superman is essentially the story of a Jewish refugee born with a Hebraic name Kal-El, who came over from the old country and anglicized his name to the waspy Clark Kent. He's an alien, technically an illegal alien, who can only interact freely with Jewish society through a disguise. He's a Jew passing for a Gentile, which back then, Jews were one of the only minorities who could do that. Jews had a better status than Black or Hispanic people, but more or less, we came after, Italians were not considered properly white, Irish, there was this whole sliding scale. But Jews could pass for Gentile to the most part, a little bit of mannerisms, a little bit of dress, a slight name change, and voila, you have a secret identity. And that is the metaphor at the core of Superman. His outfit, the red, yellow, and blue, is really made of the fabrics that his mother wrapped him in when she placed him in the vessel and sent him to Earth. It's basically his ethnic garb. It's his ethnic fabrics. And he wears it under his street clothes like a talit. And every time that he opens that shirt and declares himself to be Superman, He's not just changing his personal identity, he's changing his ethnic, his racial identity. He can decide which facet of himself interacts with the world. He is, again, especially in the context of the times, which passing was the thing to do, right? There wasn't like identity politics. He's the ultimate assimilation / assertion fantasy. And what he also was a promise. He showed homegrown Americans that refugees weren't, as many of the time insisted, clannish and ungrateful and dangerous, fifth columnists and treacherous and all this kind of stuff. They were loyal and immensely helpful. It's the gift of his heritage that proved to be invaluable to his home culture. His superpowers come from his Kryptonian heritage. It's a metaphor for how immigrants should be welcomed with open arms. And he's America's most popular hero and all-American icon, who is a powerful reminder that being an immigrant is all-American. So the core Jewish themes of Superman's mythology were formed during the 30s and 40s, and that's where so far the thought that's similar to mine about sort of the Jewish echoes of Superman's mythology sort of ended. And it didn't get picked up past there. Which is a shame because there's a lot more, and we're going to get into that. The following decades really introduced plenty of new ones. American entertainment in the 50s and 60s, particularly for those who remember, was sort of famously saccharine and sanitized, right? We had I Love Lucy, Father Knows Best, the Donna, Leave It to Beaver, those kind of things. And this is the image. What you're looking at is the image that most people have in their mind when they think of Superman of that era. Happy-go-lucky, insouciant, not a care in the world. But the truth is that this image became increasingly common throughout the 50s and into the early 60s. Superman became increasingly haunted by the destruction of his homeworld and the annihilation of his people. Story after story, he struggled with survivor's guilt. He discovered other survivors who made it he didn't even know about, like his cousin Supergirl, which is a very kind of familiar story to Jews after the war. He tried to learn more about his lost culture. This was all post-Holocaust metaphor. This was a way for his Jewish editors and writers and artists to come to terms with things and process things. My favorite example of this is the Death of Superman story from Superman number 149 from November 1961. And it's one of the last stories that his creator, Jerry Siegel, wrote in one of his 2 favorite ever stories. And it's an imaginary story, meaning it's sort of a what if. It's not canonical, doesn't really happen. And in it, Superman's nemesis, Lex Luthor, finally manages to murder him. And Luthor then runs away and goes into hiding, but he's eventually captured by an undercover Supergirl who goes on this kind of clandestine operation in costume. And she brings Luthor to Kandor, which is a miniaturized survivors Kryptonian colony that just so happens to number 6 million. Again, highly evocative, sort of like a mix between Israel and the Holocaust, sort of the She'erit HaPlita, if you know that term. And she brings him to stand trial there, not in the UN, not in the US, but there, where he stands behind bulletproof glass, and he's told, you killed a Kryptonian, therefore you will be tried by Kryptonian. If you look at the screen, this is clearly based on Adolf Eichmann's capture and trial, which this was published at the height of. Adolf Eichmann was the highest Nazi official to be captured and tried post Nuremberg. He was the architect of the final solution. He escaped to Argentina, to Buenos Aires after the Holocaust, where he hid in a false identity. He was found. The Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, in a clandestine operation, nabbed him, brought him to trial, not in the League of Nations, the United Nations, not in The Hague, but in Israel, where he was told, with me today, there are 6 million accusers. And he was put in a bulletproof glass prisoner's dock, like you see here, with a guard on each side. Even the visuals here are echoed. The comic, like the story, shows it becoming the trial of the century, and broadcast in TVs over the world, et cetera, et cetera. You see Luthor, speaking of the banality of evil, right? The famous Hannah Arendt term that came from that trial. You see Luthor as this kind of indifferent, you see Luthor's indifference standing in trial. And when he's eventually, just in case it flies over anybody's head, when he's eventually sentenced to death, he's even called the greatest villain since Adolf Eichmann. This is some serious stuff for a kid's comic book, especially at a time when kids' comics were aimed at 8 to 10-year-olds. But again, this was a way for his Jewish creators to come to terms with things. And there's dozens of examples that go in the book. I'm not going to bother you with all that. If you're really interested, check it out. I'll sort of give you a montage example. As we go through the 70s, we have new creative forces behind Superman. Siegel, at that point, sort of retired. Most of the creatives are still Jewish. Some of them are Orthodox. Some of them are secular. One of them is like a student of Kabbalah. And they bring all kinds of Jewish elements into the mythology. Top left, Superman in 1971 visits Israel, a laughably archaic Israel full of like push carts and Hasids, where he meets the first explicitly Jewish superhero ever called Seraph, who has his powers from the Staff of Moses, Cloak of Elijah, Ring of Solomon, etc., etc. Top right is a tale taking place in planet Krypton's ancient past, where a despot with the pharaonic
Roy, the slide didn't move. We're not. We don't see the next one.
That is entirely my fault. I apologize. Yeah, there's some sort of delay. I apologize. Now you see it. Top left is Seraph, the scantily clad Israeli superhero, but it's hot in Israel, so we'll forgive him. Top right is Krypton's ancient past, where they were enslaved by the pharaonic sounding Takanet to build his ziggurat fortress, his pyramid basically, and they gained freedom using a plague of hives. Again, this is the writer's wink wink. They're not trying to be that subtle, right? We have an Adam and Eve sort of humorous story that's bottom left. Another favorite of mine in the bottom right, we learned that one of Superman's ancestors, Jaf-El, was a prophet who told wicked Kryptonians in their ancient past that a flood is going to come and kill them all, and it does. Except here, instead of saving animals, animals save them, which I thought was a clever little thing. Another fun one, I'm going to the 80s, is called Miracle Monday. And this is a saga that if you're a Superman fan, you know it. Every Miracle Monday, every year, it's a hashtag that trends on social media. It started in 1979 and ran through the comics and even got its own prose book that became a bestseller in 1981. And it culminated in this 1984 story in Superman 400, which came out in October 1984. And you must be wondering, what is this Miracle Monday? And I'm glad you asked. I'll tell you. In the far-flung future, humanity will celebrate Superman, not just for saving us again and again, but also for, and I'm quoting, teaching us how to live as a free people. It's a spring holiday celebrated in the form of a family dinner on the third Monday of every May. In it, the youngest of the family explains that it is a night of the year that is different from all other nights, end quote. Rings a bell, I hope. If not, then shame on you. The father of the family, who's named Herzog and just so happens to look exactly like Chaim Herzog, the president of Israel at the time of the story, makes a toast and says, and I quote again, "Let all who are hungry come and eat," which is literally the Kol Dichfin. Each member of the family then symbolically puts a portion of their food on a plate and sets it aside upon, for Superman's return, and they all drink wine and all that kind of stuff. This is the Passover Seder, and it's not subtle. It's supposed to be winking at the audience, and yet somehow never been discussed before. But when I came across this story in my research, I got a kick out of it. And there's a lot more. There's a ton more. There's a whole saga throughout the 70s where benevolent space gods are based on Jewish archetypes. I mean, look at this guy, for example. And the malevolent space gods are based on Nazi archetypes. Again, it's in the book. I wrote a whole article about it for the forward. You can Google it. They have supernatural communication devices that wrap around the arm and look exactly like tefillin, all these kind of fun, juicy things. In the 90s, there's a storyline featuring Supergirl, where she becomes a literal angel, an agent of the Shekhinah, an angel of God, and she even meets a manifestation of God from heaven, but instead of Yahweh, he goes by Wally. So again, these guys, and this was written by a Jewish writer who is his mother's Israeli. So there's a lot of these. In 1998, there was a story where Superman is tossed back in time and tries to prevent Warsaw and Auschwitz, but because of time travel logic, he ultimately fails. And if you look at the bottom right on the panel, they even copied this from the infamous Warsaw Ghetto Boy photo. And this was a 3-part story that actually created a bit of an uproar and ended up being reprimanded by the ADL because DC was trying so hard not to offend anybody that nowhere in the 3 issues do they actually name Jews as such. And people sort of had a problem with that. And there's more. We have, a sort of creationist story. I mean, it's a Sistine Chapel, but it's still the story of the creation of Adam in the early aughts. We have, there was a more recent storyline where among the other alien race of the galaxy, there's a flaring of hidden anti-Kryptonianism that evokes modern day. Another favorite example of mine from 2019 is Perry White, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Planet, who of course is Clark Kent and Lois Lane's boss, complaining that he's about to be late for Shabbat's dinner, which is a very odd thing for a Gentile to complain about. And I really like that one. And it's just like one throwaway panel. It looks huge on the screen. It's like a little panel in the corner, but they get their kicks when they can. There was even a story where Superman was invited to Shabbat dinner, shows up in a kippah, does the Kaddish, and the Yiddish Imam kind of keeps shoveling kugel onto his plate. Not the Kaddish, Kiddush, sorry, God forbid the Kaddish. He does a Kiddush. And but that's sort of like a fish out of water story. If you look at the panel on the left, he rings the electric doorbell on Shabbat, so he clearly doesn't know what's what, but it's there. So now that we sort of did this stroll through Superman comics, is Superman Jewish? And the very Jewish answer I can give you is depends which one. And I don't mean Clark Kent or Superman or what era of his comics. What I mean is the real Superman or the fictional Superman. That is, there's a fictional Superman who is an alien from planet Krypton who just happens to look like a human. He might as well be a dolphin. He lands in Kansas. He's raised in by Christians, canonically Christian. He's Methodist or Protestant, non-practicing. He's Christian, no question, but he's this kind of pan-humanist. He's not a practicing thing. But that's the fictional Superman. There's also a real Superman, which is a fictional character in the real world, an IP, if you will. And that Superman is a Jewish character. He was created by Jews. He was developed throughout almost all of his history by Jews. He is imbued with Jewish meaning. His DNA is Jewish, and it always will be. And the reason why that's important is that comic books, especially the original superhero comics, earned their rightful place in the canon of modern Jewish literature. Alongside, it's the same shelf as Philip Roth, Sol Bellow, Bernard Malamud, Primo Levi, and others. It's people from the same background writing about the same things, just for kids and hyperbolically and colorfully, but it's the same Jewish literature. And Superman, known around the world as sort of the ultimate American icon, is revealed to actually be a Jewish American icon. Thank you. I'll stop sharing and we will open up to Q&A.
I thought that was great. If anybody has any questions, if I can't see everybody, unmute. You can unmute yourself,
or you can write in the chat, and Caroline will read it.
Right, you can. Well, I was curious, Roy. What made you what first got you interested in writing about Superman? Was there something that happened where that you were interested about Superman being Jewish?
So I grew up on comic books, and as you read so wonderfully in your introduction, I taught myself English back in Israel from comics and cartoons, and I've always been into it. And I've always recognized that there's more to play, that it's a modern mythology, that it's rich in metaphor and symbolism. I didn't read it as anything connected to my Jewish heritage, though. In my academic career, undergrad and grad, I really looked into various phenomena of pop culture from a more serious lens. Because even if what you're looking at is not serious, it's still a reflection of culture, and that examination can be serious. That was sort of the attitude. I'm actually proud to say that I started the comic book studies department at the New School University. That started because I pitched
Wow.
it, and then one teacher made it a goal and ran with it, and it was great. And my final paper for undergrad was actually by the Christian themes in Superman and how he is a Christ figure. And at some point, when I started peeling the layers, I sort of said, wait a minute. Okay, there's this, but underneath that, there's something else entirely. This guy's not a Christ figure. This guy's Moses. And then I started doing more serious historical research and found things like the unpublished memoir, which amazingly only one person ever wrote about before me, which is Larry Ty in a Superman biography, a more generic but wonderful Superman biography. So all these things coalesced, and an early version of this became a grad school thesis and won an award, et cetera, and a few years later in a research fellowship from the New York Public Library, and voila, we have the book.
Great answer. Walter Winter wants to know, is there any truth that Jay Siegel invented Superman because of his father's death?
A definite maybe. So Jerry Siegel, he lived in what was then the Jewish ghetto. Now it's sort of like a black ghetto in Cleveland, in Ohio, and his father owned a secondhand clothing shop in Cedar Central. And one day, just a group of thugs, came in, grabbed a bunch of stuff, and walked out with just the implicit threat of violence. And his father just got a heart attack and died. And it's very hard, a year and a half later, it's very hard not to see a causal relation. In his unpublished memoir, which is a whole book, Siegel only mentions this in one short line. And I think that silence, while he goes into great detail about everything else, I think that silence in of itself speaks volumes. And the fact that you get Superman who hides his identity behind these boxy suits. Not everyone wore a suit back then, despite how we kind of remember Bogart films. There's an echo there. So that's one of many influences that just sort of orbited Siegel and then at some point coalesced into what ended up becoming Superman.
L.L. Schwartz said that the inventors died in poverty. Is that true?
So this is the original sin of the comic book industry. So again, nobody thought about this as anything valuable. This was a high volume, low yield industry. And the people who published Superman, again, were not particularly honest people. They're mobsters, mob connected and all this kind of stuff. But it's not so much that they connived to steal Superman as much as once they saw its success, they sort of try to lie and cheat their way out of it. But Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster sold the rights to Superman along with their first story for $130, the flat rate of $10 a page for a 13-page story. And they lived to regret it. That led to the longest IP litigation in history, possibly the longest, definitely one of the longest, that started in 1945 and was not resolved until 2016 with the heirs. And you can argue whether it ended up in a just settlement or not, but the Siegel estate receives a multi-million-dollar payoff annually because of it, and they own a percentile of Superman. And in the book, I go into detail how the trial evolved and progressed and all that. My day job is at a law firm, so I was able to kind of understand it well enough to simplify it. So it's all in the book, yeah.
Look, I think it's Melissa has a question. Do you have a favorite time period for the Superman comics, for when they were written?
Oh, that's a great question. I never get asked anything about the actual comics. I love that. Yes, I do. If you said, I never read Superman comics, but I want to, or I haven't read them in a while, where should I pick it up? I would say two eras that are particularly recommended. One is the original Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster run that starts in 1938. And they started leapfrogging with hired artists that fill in to do fill-ins, but it really goes through the war years until 1945. There is that energy and that kind of visceral, you just see that these guys had something to get off their chest. You feel it, it leaps off the page, this kind of sense of urgency and this kind of combination of solemn consecration and cathartic glee, and it's all in there, and it's just great. And at the same time, there's that kind of innocence of 30s, 40s kids entertainment. So I would definitely read that. The second, Superman had his ups and downs throughout the years. And in 1986, DC Comics hit the reboot button And it basically said, everything you've read so far never happened. We're going to start from scratch with a brand new origin. And they hired the biggest artist at the time, John Byrne, to write and draw. He did a mini series called The Man of Steel, 6 issues, and took over Superman. And his stuff was just amazing. It was like watching a Hollywood blockbuster explosion, minus the shoddy effects of the early 80s. And in many ways prefigured the wham bam of today's comic book movies. And I think that's a roller coaster. That's just a lot of fun. So those would be my 2 favorite periods.
If anybody has a question, you can unmute yourself and ask a question directly.
Please.
I don't know, everybody's very quiet today.
I have a question.
Oh, wait, Tina, go
Yes.
ahead.
How close did the TV series keep to the comic book issues?
Not very close, but depends which ones. They've had a lot over the years, particularly if you count the cartoons. But what's interesting is that the comics also sometimes hewed back to the series. So, for example, if you think of the 1950s George Reeves Adventures of Superman, remember that guy?
Sure.
They had a low budget. It was a kids' TV show. You could see the wires in most cases. So he didn't take on aliens and giant monsters. He took on mobsters. So the comics started reflecting that, where he really fought more pedestrian enemies. In comic after comic, he goes after guys with revolvers. It just seems silly, but it sort of reflected that. And in the comic also, Clark Kent, at that time, the thinking was that Clark Kent can't be so much of a wuss. So, George Reeves's Clark Kent and Superman were almost indistinguishable. He even wore the same muscle padding under his suits as Clark Kent. And the comics also started reflecting that. And Clark Kent became tougher. He threw a couple of punches. He wooed Lois a bit more romantically. And then in the 90s, you had Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman with Dean Cain. I'm happy to say that Dean Cain liked the book and is now following me on social media. I'm getting a kick out of that. You can see him retweeting stuff. And they made it more of like a soap opera / rom-com, right? Because that's their angle. And then you see the comics of the era sort of follow suit, eventually ending in 1996, and Superman and Lois tying the knot. They are canonically married. So there's a cross-pollination. Later in the 90s, you had Superman the Animated Series, which actually did hew back to the comics a bit more, and is a bit more genuine, particularly a contribution by a famous artist called Jack Kirby. But that's its own thing.
I was just wondering, have you had any pushback from non-Jews as to what are you talking about? Or just offended maybe that the idea of Superman being Jewish?
Yeah, I mean, everybody gets offended by everything now, right? Not to sound too, I'm all in favor of being, thinking twice and being considerate, but people really are sensitive now. So first of all, a lot of people were offended. As I said, surprisingly, a lot of people thought that the title is Superman Circumcised, even though the subtitle is The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. A lot of people thought that the title was literal and got offended that I wrote a book about circumcision, especially about, it's genital mutilation. How dare you? So there's a lot of that. There were a lot of anti-Semites, some of them explicit, and some of them, I even at some point got review bombed on Amazon, and Amazon took it off, all these kind of things. A lot of anti-Semites, some of them explicit, which at least I respect the honesty. Some of them used euphemisms like, circumcision propaganda, or he's a Zionist, the shtick, right? And all that kind of stuff. But imagine if I wrote a book that did not upset anti-Semites. How much of a bummer would that be? So, I'm taking it with stride. And some people, there are stores that wouldn't carry it because they thought it might offend their customers. There were some news interviews that I missed out on. One TV producer wanted to have me on a primetime news show, I'm not going to mention which, and asked if I don't mind if they changed the title of the book in the news segment and just read the subtitle. And I said, no. So there's that too. So there's all kinds of things. And some people were a bit more good-spirited, but they felt that maybe, everybody has ownership of Superman. It's their hero. It's a reflection of American culture. And they felt that maybe I'm trying to claim him. And I said, no, this is not about bragging rights or about usurping him. It's about noting the contribution of. this is not taking away anything, it's actually adding to it. And it doesn't detract from anything else, and he can be your Jesus figure or just your all-American guy, and it's all good. But ultimately, nobody intelligent and well-meaning had a real problem with it. No, but
Okay.
there's a lot of weird guys out there. Yeah.
There's another question from the chat from LL Schwartz. My daughter, Lana Schwartz, is trying to be a writer and wrote a rom-com, build your own romantic comedy. Do you have any advice for her? Advice for a writer?
You know, my first book is a spooky fantasy for middle graders, for 8 to 12-year-olds. And I went to the book event. This is pre-COVID, so it was in person. And this mother got up in the name of her shy kid and said, my daughter wants to be an author when she grows up. Do you have any advice? And I said, yes, just be an author, don't grow up. And I think there's something to that, right? That, you know, you keep that spirit alive. Being an author is hard. And, you know, if you want to make a living out of it, then it's going to be an uphill struggle. If it's a side job and sort of a passion vocation, then that's great. There's a lot to it. The best I can say is you can find me on all social media under the tag @real Roy Schwartz, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or just Google Roy Schwartz and you'll find it. I have a website. The best thing I can offer is for your daughter, Lana, right? Like Lana Lang, Superman's first love from Smallville, to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to chat with her and share some advice as much as it's worth. It's hard. The big gatekeeper is an agent. You need to find an agent, but it's a catch-22 before they need to sort of prove yourself. So you get some pieces in the press, a bit of fiction, a bit of nonfiction. I'm fortunate enough that I write for The Forward and for CNN.com, so that gives me a bit of a platform. So if I pitch something these days, people at least listen. At least it gets past the intern, at least, you know. But it's satisfying like nothing else. It really is an amazing thing. I'm so fortunate I get to do that because so many people don't. So, you know, touch wood, I'm thankful for that every day. Yes, other questions, please.
Any other questions? I was just wondering how long from beginning, when you first had the idea, to when it was actually published, did it take? How long did it take?
6.5 years, including 2 years as a fellow at the New York Public Library. I was a writer in residence. This included reading every Superman comic book ever published, every book ever published, watching every movie, every show, listening to every radio episode that survived, reading, as far as I know, every mainstream article in the press ever in America, et cetera, et cetera. It was, you know, a dirty job, but somebody had to do it. And it took years, but I found a lot of cool stuff. And in addition to that, a lot of historical research. And I go a little bit into that in the book. So the book is written in plain English. The idea is that you read it for fun. You don't feel that it's, you know, but it came from an academic press, and it is viable as an academic source. If anybody here teaches high school, college, or whatever, the book ends with 41 pages of endnotes and bibliography. It's almost 200 sources, not including comics, about 460 sources, including comics. So it's a serious work of research, even though ultimately I wrote it to actually be fun to read and engaging and all that kind of stuff. It has humor and all these kind of things. But it was an undertaking. It was a serious undertaking.
It's muted. It's unmuted now.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Superman was always my favorite, and I always had the TV for that time. And I was just wondering, is Spider-Man written by a Jewish person also?
Sure was. So Spider-Man, who in August is going to celebrate 60 years, he showed up in August 1962, there's an argument over the patron and who created him exactly, but the official creators are Stan Lee, born in New York's Upper East Side as Stanley Martin Lieber, and Steve Ditko, who is not Jewish, and Peter Parker. So the most famous secret of the Jewish industry is that Superman is Jewish only metaphorically, only metatextually. Clark Kent isn't really Jewish. Peter Parker absolutely is. They'll never say it, but he's absolutely Jewish. He's from Forest Hills, Queens. He's a Nebish. He's Shlomi Shleimazel, you know, bespectacled, smart, cerebral. In the old comics, he constantly says things like "oi" and quips like "Mad Magazine." Although back then that was also part of the culture. These Yiddishisms turned New Yorkisms, right? His creator Stan Lee said in an interview that he regards him as Jewish. And then in later years, he says things like Mishigas and Fakakta and Shavuos and all these kind of things. Brian Michael Bendis, who's the writer who wrote him for the longest through the 90s and aughts, is a former yeshiva student from Cleveland who said, yeah, absolutely, he's Jewish. And Andrew Garfield, who played him now in 3 movies, who's Jewish, said he's Jewish. And in 2018, they had an animated movie, a wonderful movie called Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, where in a montage, you see for a second Peter Parker getting married, and at his wedding, he steps on a glass. Which again, it means something. So Spider-Man is most certainly Jewish.
Is that your next book?
No, I think people have beat me to that punch, and I don't know if there's enough volume. I am under contract for my next book already, but I cannot yet divulge more information. But if you seek me out on social media or go on my website, that's where I put all the news and soon to come more once I'm at liberty to discuss.
Sometimes, well, we have Netflix, and sometimes we watch the Mexican movies. And I find that, you know, when they have the cartels, so instead of saying they're the warlocks, let's say the warlocks were fighting the Gaons.
Okay.
Well, that's from Jewish literature.
Right.
Gaon.
Right. It's a classical language, so a lot of things kind of trace back. You know, every time when we say we love somebody, we say lev. Love is from lev. You know, there's a million examples. There's just like a lot comes from Greek, a lot comes from Hebrew, and I actually try to be very responsible in the book, saying this we know factually, this we have some evidence for, this is very plausible or likely, this is possible, this is just conjectural, and this is just me playing with it. I try to be very responsible about that. So, you know, so do not be confusing. But yeah, listen, we're around. We've gotten around over the years for sure.
Yeah, well, there are Mexican Jews, and maybe one of the directors, I thought I saw his name, and it was very Jewish. And I said, look at that. But the ones that are the actors, I don't think they question that he said they're the Gaons, because he.
You never know. People take. I see somebody in the chat, but at Real Roy Schwartz. Yeah, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. It's all and LinkedIn and Twitter, and also just royschwartz.com. It's all there and easy peasy. Any other questions? I'm happy to answer any and all. Comments.
No other questions. Oh, one last question. How was your book received in Israel? How did they feel about it?
It was received very well. I've done a lecture at the National Public Library. It's been featured, or I've been interviewed in pretty much all the newspapers and radio stations, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very, very happy about that. They will not translate to Hebrew under the idea that they're probably right that the target audience for this book can read it in English anyway, and probably prefers to read it in English anyway. So there's no point translating and then selling it for even more money that way. So I think that's probably a point. But it's through Amazon and other. It's available anywhere books are sold. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's sold if you go into Walmart and Target and so it's available in Israel. It's available over the world. So it's been well received, which I'm very grateful for. And I hope you guys like it too. I hope you give it a shot and you enjoy it.
If nobody has any other questions, I'll conclude. I thought this was great. I'm so glad we were able to get you, Roy. I want to thank Roy Schwartz for today's fascinating presentation. Roy's book, as he mentioned, is Superman Circumcised, The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. That's the full title. It's available for purchase on Amazon or anywhere else they sell books. Thank you for everyone who attended and participated in today's virtual program, and have a super afternoon. Thanks, Roy.
Fabulous.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Let's see. Why are they hearing that?
Nobody's saying anything.
Oh, that's